Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar being held under the Anti-Corruption Law Program, which is headquartered in Vancouver, British Columbia. My name is John Ritchie. I'm a co-director of the Anti-Corruption Law Program, along with my colleague and friend, Joe Weiler. Joe is a professor emeritus at the Peter A. Allard School of Law at UBC, and he's also a vice chair of Transparency International Canada. Now, the Anti-Corruption Law Program is a working partnership among three key partners: TI Canada, the Centre for Business Law at the Allard School, and the International Centre for Criminal Law Reform, also at UBC. This is actually the 26th seminar that we've held under the ACLP, and the 6th in a series of webinars that we've held since January 2021. The ACLP began as a relatively small program based in Vancouver using in-person seminars, and it has now expanded to allow people to participate worldwide. Our objective is to develop a collective action program to educate each other about anti-corruption, all aspects of anti-corruption, to improve our ability to respond to the needs of anti-corruption. This seminar, we're going to be talking about the role of technology in anti-corruption. I'd like to thank, first of all, Carol Liao, the director of the Center for Business Law, for her support in staging our webinars. Wouldn't be possible without the support of CBL, particularly also Austin Darling and Stephanie Lee of the CBL, who are providing technical backup today. Now, to get on to the subject of our webinar today, I'd like to introduce to you Norman Baldwin. Norman has been a key supporter of the ACLP since he returned to Vancouver in 2017. He has been active for over 30 years in the business integrity field. And from 1995 to 2017, he was based in Brazil. And among the activities he engaged in Brazil was to support anti-corruption investigations, contributing to Lava Jato, something that many of you will have heard of course. Norman played a major role in organizing this session, and I'd like to thank him personally for all of the efforts he's made this session and with many of our others. So now I'll turn it over to you, Norman, and thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to the Anti-Corruption Law Program for giving me and our panelists today the opportunity to talk about anti-corruption technologies, which is a topic near and dear to my heart. To all of our participants out there in the listening world today, welcome to all of you. I know we have participants in probably just almost every continent on Earth today. So whether it's good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, a welcome to all of you. And just to let you know that a recording of today's event will be made available to all the participants. It will be made available on various LinkedIn pages and also emailed out to people who are on the Anti-Corruption Law Program mailing list. As John mentioned, we are connected with the University of British Columbia. So before we start, we would like to acknowledge with gratitude that the campuses of the University of British Columbia, or at least the campus in Vancouver, is situated on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, while UBC's Kelowna campus is in the territory of the Syilx, Okanagan Nation. The seminars hosted by the Anti-Corruption Law Program are designed to help public and private sector policymakers combat corruption more effectively. We want to be able to bring together industry experts who share their unique ideas and insight. And today is no exception, as we have a terrific panel which is going to examine the capabilities, challenges, and future trends of anti-corruption technologies. The topic of ACT, or anti-corruption technologies, is a rather large one, and there is no way we are going to be able to examine every aspect of it in detail today, but hopefully we will be able to give experts and beginners alike plenty to chew on. Now, during today's discussion, you will be hearing terms like algorithms, training data, and GovTech, but fear not, we will be explaining and defining all of these and other terms as we go along. So to start, let's dive in with some numbers that I've pulled together that are often used in anti-corruption seminars. You don't need to write any of these numbers down, and I will explain why. So the first number is a large one. It is $1 trillion in bribes paid every year around the world. The second one is the amount of public funds that are stolen or embezzled every year, and that number is $2.6 trillion. A very commonly used number is what corruption costs the global economy, which is around 5% of global gross domestic product each year. Some other numbers, between 10 and 25% of government procurement is lost to corruption each year, and up to 30% of the value of publicly funded infrastructure is lost to corruption each year. Now, you don't need to write any of those numbers down, because according to a study that was published just a few months ago by Cecily Watney of the U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Center, there appears to be no credibility to these numbers, even though they are used endlessly in webinars and papers and so forth. Cecily found that there actually had been no proper methodology used to obtain these numbers. They began as rough estimates or best guesses that appeared in a speech or a paper somewhere. They then were transformed into factoids and eventually somehow became empirical data. Sounds kind of familiar if you repeat something enough. So what are the real numbers about corruption? Well, the truth is we don't really know. But I think it's safe to say that the numbers are large enough to cause what we can see and feel as the corrosive effects of corruption. And it is these bad or negative outcomes of corruption that I think we really should be focused on rather than just thinking about numbers. So what are some of the bad outcomes and the corrosive effects of corruption? There's a long list. I can just sort of give you a couple here. Violations of human rights, the formation of black markets, undermining of democracy and the rule of law, increased child mortality rates, and all of these nasty situations that we read about every day, they can allow things like domestic and transnational organized crime, terrorism, and human trafficking to flourish. So that's why we always have to be combating corruption, because it just leads to some very large scale negative elements on this planet. So where does technology fit into all of this? And can it really combat the abuse of entrusted power for private gain? And that's how Transparency International defines corruption. So the short answer to that question is yes, corruption can, or pardon me, technology can, and it does combat corruption, but it's a qualified yes, because anti-corruption technologies really are still in their infancy, and they still do require a very firm human guiding hand. Now, for many, many years, one of the best anti-corruption weapons has been OSINT, or open source intelligence, which we'll be discussing very shortly. And while OSINT is still an essential tool, these days, the bigger research and development money is being shifted to things like blockchain and big data analytics, and of course, the holy grail of anti-corruption technologies, which is machine learning, which in itself, interestingly, can be married to open source intelligence. So we'll be examining all of these things, as well as several of the other tools available, including some low-tech solutions that are out there. So having said all of that, I would now like to introduce our wonderful panel of experts, beginning with Paula Davis. Paula is based and coming to us today from Manchester in England. Paula is the founder and director of Waypoint GRC, and for over 25 years, she has been instrumental in the development, implementation, and management of effective compliance and ethics programs in a range of complex and geographically diverse organizations. We also have from Seattle, Washington, Christopher Nelson. Chris is with Microsoft, where he leads their compliance analytics program. And he is also a core member of their anti-corruption technology and solutions program, which I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about. And that particular program partners with governments to deliver know-how, technology, and resources to the front lines of the fight against corruption. Joining us from São Paulo, Brazil, an old friend of mine, full disclosure, I have worked with and beside our next panelist, Eduardo Tardelli, for many, many years. Eduardo is the CEO of Aplexus Tecnologia, and for the past 12 years, he has led the growth of his UpMiner platform, which is a wonderful anti-corruption tool. And it is, in fact, Brazil's leading due diligence and background check data aggregator. Eduardo also oversees projects in web data mining, big data, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. So you can see why we've got him on the panel today. So we are very, very fortunate to have Eduardo with us, and I'm looking forward also to hearing his contributions. And joining us from Toronto, Ontario, we have Amber Scott. Amber combines a passion for technology with a focus on Canadian anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, privacy, and regulatory compliance. She has held senior compliance and anti-money laundering forensics roles with various major organizations in Canada. She is the founder and CEO of the Outlier Compliance Group, which develops compliance solutions based on the premise that good compliance can enable good business. And who can argue with that? So we are going to look at, as I mentioned, the capabilities, the challenges, and the future trends of anti-corruption technologies. So let's start with the capabilities of the tools that are currently out there. The tools available to practitioners today to detect fraud and money laundering are many and varied. But what about corruption? So let's talk now about the types of anti-corruption tools that are currently available and what they are capable of. And I would like to start with Eduardo down in São Paulo, who can give us an overview of the types of technologies available, such as software as a service, open source intelligence, artificial intelligence, and its subset, machine learning, blockchain, big data, etc. Eduardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Norman. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. It's an honor to participate here with, as a speaker, so I try to teach a little bit and learn with everybody. I did some notes here. It's a huge issue. We can talk hours and hours about that, but I'm trying to put some specific points here, talking about technology and giving you guys some examples of business applications and of course government applications. So let's start with the concept of data. Let's talk about data, information, and knowledge. We live in a digital world, so everything is data. We have a huge amount of data, and data just being data is not something really important. But when you put data inside a business concept, an environment, you have information. And information aggregated with skills, human skills and knowledge, experience, you have the knowledge. And the knowledge, make the difference between you and your competitor. So knowledge is what the companies, what everybody wants to have. But to reach the knowledge, you need good data, you need technology, you need to select everything that you need to do to reach the knowledge. And of course we're going to talk about all this, but this is the starting point. Let's talk first, one of the disruptive technology, it's cloud, of course. So when cloud appears, we have a huge amount of computer processing, so it's infinite. And of course, everybody can reach that, very, it's not expensive, how it used to be, decades ago to use a computer. So cloud is one thing. Another thing is big data. So what is big data? Big data, I'm trying to be as simple as I can be here, to everybody understand. But what is big data? Big data, it's a huge amount of data that, you have to reach volume. So you need a huge volume. You need velocity. So you have to grow your data with at least a specific velocity. You need a variety of data, and you need a veracity. So must be, from a specific data source, can be, bad data, must be something that has some veracity. And of course, an example of this in this world, we have databases, that we use, a lot of companies in the market. For example, these worldwide players that have watch lists, political exposed people lists, sanction lists. So it's an example of big data that we can use against corruption, for example. Another example of technology is OSINT, open source intelligence, as Norman said. So this is something very powerful. We can access public data and use that, in our business concept, to avoid corruption, fraud. But of course, a lot of, I say, that it's a lot of data, and a little bit of data, it's a problem. So you have to reach, the optimum point, to use that in your favor. So we have, of course, depends the country. Some countries you have more data available. Other countries has less data available. For example, if we compare China with US, China with Europe and Latin America, so it's different. Each one of these environments. So of course, if you can reach this data, you can use that in your favor, and you can cross, outside data with inside data, the data that you have inside your company. So this is very powerful too. Always, applying technology to do that. And of course, always, trying to find the relevant information. You have to, the relevant information for my company is different from another company. So each one in your specific business has your relevant information. And of course, all these open data sources, you have different types of access to this data. So it's a bottleneck to access the data. Everybody talks about, artificial intelligence, oh, let's do something, but at least, the first point, you need data, and the data is a bottleneck, because you have to access that, you have to organize that, you have to classify, you have to store, and then you have to use that in your favor. So there's a lot of ways to access this data. So you can download, for example, a huge file of public data. You can use crawlers like robots that, can access all this data. You can use APIs if you have an access to an API. So some public sectors have APIs. This is something really good. The programmers love that. So you can use an API. What's an API? Application program interface. So it's something that, there's a pattern that you can use with all the documentation. So it's really good for a programmer, but it's not in all the cases that we have that, and an example of OSINT, we have, for example, as Norman said, UpMiner and many others, solutions in the market that you can use, to enrich your due diligence process, background checks, so you can, decrease your risk when you make a decision, to interact with a customer, a supplier, or even an employee. Another technology that we have, so it's RPA, so it's robot process automation. That is something that's really powerful too. When you want to automate your process, so there's a lot of manual process, that you face the human mistakes, for example, and you don't have sometimes patterns. So when you do the RPI, the robot process automation, you can, improve your process. You can gain velocity, reduce costs, and etc. So it's very important too. There's a lot of solutions, using RPA. Talking about machine learning and artificial intelligence, here is a huge, it's a huge amount of examples. So talking about artificial intelligence, is examples of solutions using artificial intelligence. Text to speech is one of them. Speech to text, image recognition is another example. Just applications about that. NPL, natural language processing, that depends the language, the idiom that we are using, the country. So everything, it's really specific. And what is machine learning basically? So if I talk about machine learning, what is machine learning basically? Is to teach, the machine to do what the humans been doing. So it's something that, we have to use, but of course we have to teach the machine, and the machine learn, it really fast. But at the same time, if you don't do nothing, if you're not continuing the process, keep teaching the machine or monitoring at least, the machine will start to do some, bad decisions, because, it's, you have to everything. It's like an alive system. You have to reuse the data, you have to monitoring and everything. So that's why we have the training process. We have the supervised and supervised methods, reinforcement, learning from errors. So everything, in this concept of machine learning. And of course, data quality is essential. As I told you, first of all is to reach the data. The second is the quality of the data. So the quality of the data is something really important when we're talking about machine learning. We have a lot of frameworks, sometimes open source frameworks, others you have to pay, but there's a lot of frameworks in, the market. So it's everything that is ready to use. It's like a library. You go there and you pick a book. So here you go there and you pick a specific function that, you attend some specific issue of your business. So it's all statistical methods, but everything is ready to use. So technology is becoming more and more commodity. So from, the time passing through, the technology is becoming more and more commodity. And of course, there's a lot of promises in machine learning. So you have for example, you can use machine learning, to identify an event, a risk event or a fraud event. So machine learning can help that. Machine learning can help to notify, so to send an alert, for example. So when you use for monitoring process, it's something very useful. Machine learning can suggest something that, it may be wrong, it's out of this threshold. Could you check that? And, you can deliver to a human being to analyze, for example. You can automate process with machine learning. You can predict, so predict the future. You can predict some events based in the past events that's already in the database. You can use for prevention too, so you can prevent events from happening. And the holy grail that I would say is the situation that awareness. So even preventing and saying what you must do if something happens, if an event happens. So this machine learning, it's the promises that machine learning brings to the society. Of course, you need data, you need to have technology to reach this point and to use the benefits of that. And talking about some example of projects, using machine learning, principally for combat corruption. In Brazil, for example, we have a public project that's called Serenata Project. It's a project that they use the public government data, talking about the use of the public money from government, and they cross all that and they start to use these parameters to access some specific events, for example. So they have, for example, one deputy, one government official that spent more than $1,000 in one meal, for example, using public money. So it's right there in the middle of the database, but when you use machine learning, it's right in front of you. So they can reach to a lot of officials. They use the limits, the day limits use of the meal money, for example. Each one has a specific limit to use each day. So it's one of them. There's another case here. So it's very, very, very simple, that they found a government official that spent, dollars in Vegas, for example, using public money. So this is another example. And to finish, I would talk about blockchain. Blockchain is another technology too. So we use, it's like, you can write in a stone, something that you can't delete, but there's a lot of technology using that. So for example, you can use for supply chain process, to register every step of your chain, and to using smart contracts too. So it's another application. It can reduce human mistakes. And you can use for government procurements too. So there's a lot of applications for government procurements, using public money, and you can scan all the steps from the chain. And the regulation, the problem of blockchain, that the regulation is still ongoing. So it's something that, we're moving on. It's a technology that's in the first step of nature. So basically, this is what I would say in this first question.
Fantastic, Eduardo. That was a terrific overview of several of the types of technologies, the main technologies that are currently available, and what they do and how they're being used in Brazil. And I'm glad you mentioned that data is really at the heart of everything, and it's the quality of the data that the manufacturers or the providers use in terms of how to train the machines for their machine learning outcomes. And we'll be talking about training data in a little bit. Certainly in Brazil, where public data is widely available, far more so than where I'm sitting here in Canada, and Chris could talk about the example in the United States, but certainly in Brazil, anybody who has access to a computer can access an immense amount of publicly available data. It's so simple. And then there are commercial sites, which if you want to pay a very small fee, you can access even more data, but then you have to essentially cross-reference it with the public data that you've received, and maybe a few other data sources to filter it out to really see, which is the data that you feel is the most accurate. But certainly Brazil is the perfect training ground right now for machine learning, because there's so much data to use. And unfortunately, there's an awful lot of corruption. So you have this kind of perfect storm, if you will, or perfect environment to use machine learning. High amount of public data available, high amount of corruption. It's a perfect environment for it. And Eduardo, you're sort of sitting in the hot seat there in São Paulo, so you're really in the right place at the right time. So thank you for that overview of the technologies currently being used for anti-corruption purposes. I want to turn now to Amber in Toronto. She's been working with anti-money laundering technologies for many, many years. And I'd like to hear your take on not so much anti-money laundering technologies, but technologies in general that are being used to combat financial crime. What's been your experience with them, and are they shifting from, say, anti-fraud, anti-money laundering, or companies' mentality shifting towards anti-corruption, or is that still something that's just something that's off in the future?
So let me start by saying that I'm incredibly enthusiastic about technology. And I think it's important to start with that, because everything that's going to come out of my mouth is going to sound very cynical. One of the primary problems that I see in terms of technology and its application in a world where we're looking at financial crime, and particularly compliance related to financial crime, is that sometimes we have very different goals. And so technology companies are looking at solving a problem in a very different way than compliance people are looking at solving the problem. And ultimately, you would think, aren't we all trying to manage risk and prevent, detect, deter financial crime? And the answer to that is sometimes. I would say in Canada in particular, we have a very big tone from the top problem in terms of how we deal with that. And I don't mean the CEOs of banks, I mean actually from the Department of Finance and how we as Canada measure the effectiveness of anti-money laundering within our own regime, which has one metric, which is how do we perform on our FATF mutual evaluation? Full stop. There are no other measures that our government considers in terms of how are we doing for anti-money laundering. And you might say, but Amber, certainly we look at arrests and we look at cases and we look at how this affects all of these other things. No, we're looking at essentially how we immature approach as a nation to anti-money laundering, to risk management, to anti-corruption. And I think we've seen that bear out in a number of unfortunate ways in Canada. I will tell you that as an anti-money laundering subject matter expert, I actually will not speak at Chamber of Commerce events in Canada. And the reason that I do not do that is that 100% of the time, someone, usually a property developer, will come up to me after the event and say, hey, so a year ago, last year, these aren't 20 years ago, they're recent, I decided to bid on this public tender and I was asked for a bribe by city council, the province, take your pick, I have heard them all. So when we have questions about corruption in developing countries, I think that a lot of the time we really need to look at what are we doing here? What data is available here? How do we make things more transparent here? How do we hold things more accountable in Canada? Because we are not setting the standard in that regard. In terms of how we solve that problem, and the reason that I mentioned the report card and how do we manage our risk, how do we think about risk, I think that technology companies often approach things where they look at it and say, how do we pull in this data? How do we manage risk? And from a company perspective, companies are also needing to look at how do we meet our very exacting compliance requirements that are sometimes quite prescriptive. And the same system that meets my compliance requirement isn't necessarily going to manage my risk effectively, and vice versa. And that's a really unfortunate thing that we see play out in a number of ways. But when companies need to make a choice between, do I meet my prescribed compliance requirements? Is that where I spend my money? Or do I spend my money on the system that's more efficient at actually managing the underlying risk? They will, and frankly, from an overall company risk management, probably should choose the system that meets their compliance requirements every step of the way. So I think as technology companies, we need to do better at understanding compliance requirements. And that's hard. Compliance requirements are different by jurisdiction. They vary by province. They vary by nation. Whereas your technology solution can be global and you can deploy it instantly. I think the other side of that coin is that policymakers really need to start taking a step back and figuring out where we can be more principles-based, where we can be more technology agnostic, where we can talk about solutions as being something that manages risk as opposed to prescribing exactly how we do it. And I think one of the funniest non-financial crime examples of the effect of being very prescriptive is butter. I love butter. The best butter in Canada is made in a place called Sterling, Ontario. And the reason that that butter is so tasty and about $1 a pound more expensive than any other butter is that it has 82% milk fat. The rest of the butter that I'm aware of that's made in the Canadian market has 80% milk fat. Why does it have 80% milk fat, you ask? That's a great question. It has 80% milk fat because that is the minimum prescribed amount that you can have for a product to be called butter. Sterling butter is tastier by simply having 2% butter, which is crazy when you think about it. But this is where we are from a risk and technology perspective. When a compliance team is looking at a system, they need to know, does it meet my requirement? Is it 80% milk fat? And it might be something else, but it's not meeting that requirement, even if it's amazing. And so first and foremost, they're looking for, is it meeting my compliance requirement? Because if it's not doing that, I am probably going to get a penalty. And secondary to that is, how is it actually managing the risk? How is it managing the underlying problem? I think that one of the other issues that we face as a nation is that when it comes to technology, it's not just about how private companies are deploying technology. It's about how police forces are deploying technology. It's about how those are being used in investigation. What I can do as a banker or as a money service business is diminutive compared to what the RCMP can do by making actual arrests. And I'm not just picking on the RCMP. I'm police. I love you. But we have a major issue in terms of fraud, in terms of financial crime, and in terms of related prosecutions. When I went to the last in-person Payments Canada conference on pillars, there was the beautiful, here's interchange fees in Canada and how much that accounts for. And here are all of these different things. And the highest number on any of those pillars in terms of single value thing in Canada was fraud. If I was very dark hat with my MBA, what I would be thinking is fraud. That's where the money is. That's where I should be headed. But there's a huge cost, and this isn't the numbers that Norman talked about earlier. This is actual measurable financial fraud in our system. When American companies come to Canada, they're often shocked by how much online fraud they're dealing with in our environment compared to what they're dealing with in the US. And that there seems to be no one who's willing to take a police report about it. And this is, I think, something that we have to think about in terms of long-term strategy. How do we develop tools for police forces? How do we train police forces? How do we do better at supporting trials and the evidence that's needed in trials to have actual prosecutions? Because that's not necessarily the same thing that you need to detect what may be a suspicious transaction at a bank level. So I think that technology plays an incredibly important role. I think that we have a lot of work to do, and I hope that we get there. But it's a journey, I think, not a destination. And I'll stop there for now.
Wow, that was a very clear-eyed summation of the current state of affairs, Amber. Thank you so much for that. Very glad that you mentioned how it is in Canada regarding our sort of emphasis on these thresholds. For example, I spoke with David Creamer at Scotiabank the other day, and he was mentioning that so much of their time is taken up because their anti-money laundering threshold, at which point the alarm bells go off with their artificial intelligence systems, they start going off at a fairly, I won't mention the actual monetary level, but it's a fairly low level. And so what happens is that all of a sudden his team is activated to go and investigate some suspicious activity which has taken place, unfortunately, at a very low level, when in reality, the bigger crimes are happening at a much higher threshold. And unfortunately, his hands are tied, his team's hands are tied, but that's what they have to do. Because that's, I guess that's a sort of a FinTrack threshold that's been set, not probably arbitrarily and not necessarily by the bank.
Well, no, the threshold for suspicious activity is $0.
It's $0, yeah.
And I think there's something interesting that happens from a legal and a prosecution and investigation perspective as well, is that the more money that's involved, the more that becomes a complex long-term investigation, as opposed to something that's easy and simple and straightforward.
I think we need Microsoft to the rescue. They need to ride in and rescue the Canadian government on this one. We now want to turn it over to Christopher Nelson in Seattle. He is with Microsoft, but more importantly, he is going to be discussing the program at Microsoft that he's associated with, and it's a fantastic initiative that Microsoft has put forward. called the Anti-Corruption Technology Solutions Program. So Chris, please take it away. And it's just as a little entree here, Microsoft is working hand in hand with governments around the world to address the exact same problem that Amber was just discussing. So Chris, I'm hoping you can shed some light on how perhaps we've got some solutions out there.
Sure. Thank you, Norman, and everybody for inviting me to participate today. Super excited to talk to you guys about ACTS. That's Microsoft's, as Norman said, Anti-Corruption Technology and Solutions Program. So this program started about a year ago, and it was built on some of the work we've done internally to detect and deter, compliance problems, misconduct in our sales channels by employees and partners. And over about 3 or 4 years, we started to figure out that technology can play a huge role, not alone, but it can greatly speed and enhance our efforts to control the kinds of practices that are very similar to the kinds of practices that governments are trying to control in the corruption space. So we thought, well, let's go out and talk to some governments and see if there are some of the techniques we're using internally and some technologies we have that they can then deploy to solve those similar problems. And I guess, the top level review of the year is, holy cow, we learned a lot. This is an incredibly complex space, of course, as no doubt everyone here knows. And we're looking at it from really a 3-phase approach. So the closest analogy I have to those 3 phases is something like Gary Becker's, theory of crime. And he describes this idea that, criminals are, doing a mental calculus. They're looking at the expected benefits of doing something wrong and then the expected cost of it. And the costs of it are a function of like, how likely are you to be caught? And if you are caught, what is the punishment for that? So what we're focused on are the first 2 pieces of that calculus. So we're focused on trying to look for ways to use technology to eliminate the gains that are available via corruption. And primarily there, it comes down to automation and eliminating touch points in bureaucratic and government processes. So, the human-to-human touch points that can be eliminated, they can either be eliminated altogether without technology, that's a legislative affair, but you can also use technology to slot into an existing structure, whether it's customs, tax, licensing, regulatory. And there is a lot of research out there that shows that when you eliminate those low value bureaucratic touch points in those spaces, you can have a meaningful material impact on corruption because you're reducing the opportunity for those gains to take place. Simple examples of this are around the world, whether it's, in Mexico City, there's no longer discretion as to which customers get flagged for search and interrogation upon entry into the country. It's a red light, green light system. That's a really basic system, but that's the first area that we're focused on. The second is deterrence. And here it's much more complicated, and we're taking a much sort of humbler and more curious approach to it, because on the deterrence front, we're really focused on the probability of detection. And this is where technology can play the greatest role. The punishment side of it, it's not really in scope for the program. So we're looking at ways to take data, make it transparent, and then do the very, very hard thing of making the kinds of conduct that we care about observable in that data. And this is a huge task in many places. It depends on data being relevant. That is, it has the information in it that is relevant to the kinds of conduct you're looking at it. The data needs to be comprehensive in the sense that it captures all of the behavior. So it can't, if it's an e-procurement system, it can't just capture one, sector like agriculture and not construction. And you need to really have a whole picture. And then the data needs to be usable. And the things that we've learned is that there's, major failure points across all of those 3 important stages, which leads to the opportunity for us, right? Which is to improve the transparency using cloud, like, Microsoft's got an Azure cloud. We're trying to aggregate data sources in that cloud, utilize and leverage like the open contracting standard and Microsoft's common data model to then apply some basic machine learning and AI techniques that will let people make informed empirical decisions about where to look next and what to focus on. So we've had the most success in this space where we've stepped in and started helping enforcers and audit officials automate and improve their existing monitoring processes. So these are systems that are already set up. So auditors today, right, supreme audit institutions around the world, their purpose is to screen effectively a percentage of the transactions that are coming in for signs of misconduct. This is a great area for technology to play a role. We can help them with natural language processing and optical character recognition and some of these technologies to digitize manual records, and then begin to build algorithms that will learn what kinds of language in contracts, what kinds of anomalies across contracts are worthy of flagging to improve their sampling efficiency, which is basically to say, if they're reviewing 2% of contracts that are coming through in detail and spending those resources, that human element, we're going to get them a better 2% using technology than they would have randomly or by some other method. And then the final, and this is sort of the most challenging space for us, is to think about how to help governments introduce brand new systems of observation where there is no existing framework. And this is in some ways, this is where corruption is the worst, where there isn't an existing way because the data is disparate or it's not being collected. So there's no way for enforcers to observe the kinds of things they need to observe. So beneficial ownership might come into this space. Procurement is not very effectively monitored today around the world. But keep in mind, these are extraordinarily complex systems. They vary by country. So we're definitely taking this slow, and we're working with local officials, with local partners, bringing expertise and know-how to solve those key problems of tech, people, and action not really being in place around these sort of harder problems. So our biggest success to date in the first year was with the Inter-American Development Bank. We just on June 30 did a press release with the government of Paraguay and the IDB. We had developed an e-procurement monitoring system called the Spread Flags Project. It is now being deployed and piloted in Paraguay to start to bring real-time flagging to some of the low-hanging fruit in procurement. Whether it's bidding anomalies, it's the way tenders are designed. So there's a number of flags we've developed with them, and we've launched that system now with IDB. So that's in a nutshell what we're focused on. This is a 10-year project for us at least. We're just getting started, but we're really excited to partner with NGOs and governments to make it happen.
That is impressive, Chris. Thank you so much for that. Certainly governments everywhere have this, as you point out, they've got two ways of addressing it: the technology side, and then on essentially the legislative or policy side. Are we going to allow data to be accessible? Are we going to have a beneficial ownership registry, which Amber knows only too well? Things that are happening here in Canada. We've had this massive dogfight going on for years in all the provinces and at the federal level about a beneficial ownership registry. Well, now it's in the works. It's starting to move forward. That sounds great, but how is it actually going to work in practice? How are you going to get the lawyers and the accountants and the real estate people and so forth to submit data about their clients into this database? So there's plenty of things to be dealing with on the government side. From the technology side, a lot of the solutions now are there, as we've discussed. Eduardo has mentioned a lot of these great solutions that are out there. Amber has mentioned some of the pitfalls that are out there, and now Chris has given us more opportunities for governments to look at it from a technology side. But also, I'm really glad Microsoft is examining it from the other side of the coin as well, which is, what can you guys do from a legislative / policy point of view? Because it's not just a technology-based solution. If you're just relying 100% on technology for your e-procurement or what have you, the corruption is still going to be there. You have to have the other side of the coin. Now, I'd like to turn now to, and again, please dive in if you've got other things you want to ask any of the other panelists, please. Paula, Davis now is joining us from Manchester, as I mentioned earlier. And again, a bit of full disclosure here. I have worked peripherally with Paula with regard to an anti-corruption technology provider in Europe, mainly in the whistleblowing side, and we'll be hopefully dealing with that in another webinar in the future, because certainly whistleblowing technologies are an anti-corruption technology. They are, in fact, an essential tool that companies need to have. They can be as simple as a hotline or something a little more complex, something that deals with mobile phones and apps and so forth. But those technologies are out there. And as I say, I'm hoping we're going to be discussing them in a future webinar. Paula, if you could just give us an idea from your point of view. I know that you're more of the human side in your professional experience. So we've now seen and heard from the other panelists about the technological side, Amber a little bit more on some of the legislative and policy sides. What about the human element in all of this?
Yeah, thanks, Norman. And I mean, I'm blown away by some of the stuff that I've heard, and it does make me, as perhaps a natural cynic in this space, feel really quite optimistic about the possibilities of what technology could do. My own hands-on experience, as you mentioned, tends to be at the kind of perhaps lower level technologies, the whistleblowing solutions and so on. And I think we've all got used now to whistleblowing as a kind of standard feature of most compliance programs. And I think that's only going to continue as we see legislation like the EU whistleblowing directive, which is in force. I think it has to be implemented by December this year. It's just going to keep pushing at organizations having these whistleblowing solutions. But I think what a lot of compliance teams are looking for isn't just to kind of tick a box. I think that what people would like to get out of this is data that gives them kind of meaningful and actionable insights into the operation of their compliance programs, and ideally at a kind of lower level, a bit like Chris was saying, helping to detect and even prevent wrongdoing. So I think they can be really powerful tools. But frankly, my gut feeling is that the reporting rates that we see are just really low and somewhat skewed. I think even your big multinationals, they're seeing low single-digit reports per 1,000 employees, 2-3 reports per 1,000 people. That really, to me, does not sound like a lot. If we just think about our own common sense experience of what we see happening in workplaces. And in fact, there's an organization in the UK called the Institute of Business Ethics, and they did a survey in 2018, and they found that almost half of observed misconduct in the workplace goes unreported. And I don't think this is necessarily an issue with the technology. And what we see is that one of the main reasons that people don't report wrongdoing that they observe is fear of retaliation. And in fact, an ECI survey, I think conducted last year, found that rates of retaliation are skyrocketing. So I think really whistleblowing systems don't just have issues of technology to deal with, they have issues of behavior and organizational culture and trust. It's no good having any kind of technology if people are frankly too afraid to use it because of what the consequences may be. Having said that, I mean, I do also have concerns about whistleblowing systems and technologies. They are typically some kind of reporting channels are used, and there's some kind of case management system sitting underneath it to kind of log and manage issues. And one of my concerns is around the reporting channels, because so many of these systems rely on some kind of call center service. And I think there are a couple of problems with this. And it is still, where there is a telephone service, it is still by far the vast majority of reports that organizations get come in via telephone. my issue with this is if you think about the places in the world where corruption is kind of endemic and where we are really concerned about risk and workplace wrongdoing and corruption, these are often places with challenges around infrastructure and telecommunications. And where things do exist, they tend to be mobile, cell phone based. Now, these whistleblowing systems tend to depend on call a toll-free number. If you've ever tried to do that from any of these locations, it really is not simple. Whether a toll-free number works will depend on who the local telecom supplier is, on whether you're using a landline or a mobile phone. There are so many, what we think of as quite basic technical issues that would prevent someone making a simple, easy, toll-free call to one of these numbers. You're going to get patchy coverage, or perhaps not working at all. The other thing that concerns me is that a lot of these services are sold as, we're talking about sensitive workplace issues, wrongdoing, someone plucking up the courage to call one of these services. They need a sensitive, well-trained human on the other end of that call to deal with this issue and tease out the finer details, make the person feel safe, comfortable, confident, and so on, which I completely agree with. I think that would be wonderful. But of course, a lot of this depends on the person taking your call, speaking your language. And I think what you find is that a lot of these big call centers, they'll cover maybe half a dozen languages. Certainly in Europe, you're going to get French speakers, Spanish speakers. But beyond that, that there is a real lack of meaningful coverage of languages in many of these areas of the world where we are most concerned about corruption.
Can these tools, sorry, Paula, can these tools use technology, for example, automatic translation or automatic language detection?
I have seen ones that will do that quite well as text. So if you're talking about a reporting channel where the input is through web reporting or an app, then Microsoft, in fact, has an incredible translation capability that will do instant translation to and from different languages. I think that there are about 60 languages available. And yes, I think that can give a very satisfactory service. But whilst we still have this huge imbalance towards telephone, I am not aware of voice services that can offer that same level of quality and speed of translation. So the solution tends to be the operative has to say, please wait until we get an interpreter on the line. And then, the whole issue of trust and everything else kind of goes out of the window, I guess, because you're having a three-way conversation that you've usually had to wait quite a long time for with an interpreter who presumably is not this qualified, sensitive, caring, whistleblowing handler, but someone who's, a freelance or whatever. I mean, I may be being a bit cynical there, but, I do think that there are concerns for me, even with these very basic technologies. So my advice to anyone who's looking at implementing or improving their whistleblowing solution is, as a minimum, if you're going to use a phone service as a key part of this, then you must mystery shop it. You must, especially if you're in multiple countries and using multiple languages, you must try and get people in situ in those places. Does the line work? Do I get through? Do I get an appropriate and positive experience of reporting concerns? And I think that, that's a kind of minimum must do for these solutions. But really, I think the best whistleblowing solution is trust, is an organization where there is a meaningful speak up culture that is supported actively and openly from the top through the middle management to everyone, where there is no fear of retaliation, where there is trust and confidentiality. Ultimately, I think it's not a technical solution to learning about wrongdoing in the workplace, I think it's a cultural solution. Not to say you don't need the whistleblowing systems there, of course you do, but I think there's so much else that we need to wrap around it to really make them work and give us the powerful data that we really do want to have.
Don't necessarily need to have a lot of very high-tech solutions. A low-tech solution like a whistleblower channel, cameras, staff that have access to an app on their mobile phones so that they can report something, they can film something, they can send something in to their boss, assuming there's trust between the employee and their boss. So these are all sort of lower tech solutions that are out there, and there's some that I want to even discuss in the next section, and I know Eduardo I'm going to be asking him about it, and that's like digital signatures, for example. These aren't necessarily very high tech and expensive solutions, but they're out there and they're useful, and they all form part of this larger arsenal of weapons that we have to deter corruption. I just wanted to ask Eduardo very quickly about OSINT, which is sort of this, when we think of OSINT, if you think of it as something very, very simple, like a Google search. Okay, that's probably the most basic, simplistic OSINT activity that someone can do. So if someone says, I want to do research on possibly this corrupt government official, you just type in their name and you may get some newspaper articles about them. Maybe they've actually been involved in a scandal in the past. Okay, so Google search has maybe helped you out. And that is an open source intelligence tool. But there's thousands and thousands of data sources out there. And I know that Eduardo's company aggregates data from, I think it's something, a couple of thousand of them now, in order to provide and filter data to its clients. How do you decide on which ones of these are useful and which ones are just almost fraudulent? Because people have access to data sources, and so they can actually manipulate and alter the data. We can talk about this in the next section of the challenges, but how can you be sure that the data you're using and essentially providing onto your clients is useful?
Yeah, great question, Norman. The menu is huge. You have a lot of options, and sometimes the user, the final user, the compliance officer or the analyst, it's a doubt, but you have to start with something. So you start at least with what the law tells you to do. So here, for example, in Brazil, you have the central bank, you have the Federal Bureau, and you have some specific, data sources that you have to access. At least, for example, exposed people is one of them. Shareholders, the beneficial owner, the final beneficial owner is another one. Process, low process, for example, if you have some criminal records, is another one. Here in Brazil, we have at the same time, we have the International Transparency Organization. In Brazil, we have the Brazilian Transparency Organization too. That there's a lot of information there. For example, companies that cannot do business with governments because they had some bad issue at the past and now is in a blacklist. People that somehow had some problem with government too. So it's all public, and you can access that too. And of course, you have the international data sources too, for example, terrorists, slave work here in Brazil. It's a big issue in a third world country. And imagine that you have like a image risk for your company if you have like a supplier that use slave work. So it's a big issue here, and it's a compliance problem. So you have to access this kind of information too. And of course, you have the big search engines as Google, as Bing, and Yahoo, and many others. And you have, of course, we can talk, in the challenges. You have the fake news, you have the false positives, you have the anonymous. So all these problems you have to face too. And of course, then the technology is the way. It's not It's not the end point. You know, it's a way to help, but it's not the end point. So the technology can help, you know, somehow, but it's not the final solution. You still have problems, you know, challenges to face.
You still have humans to look at this data and say, I don't believe this.
Oh yeah,
I want to cross-check this with something else.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah. So we have a lot of technical. So we're going to just wrap up this first section then on the capabilities of the technologies that are out there. And I wanted to just run something past Amber here. I spoke, and I mentioned that I had spoken with David Creamer at Scotiabank, and he gave me, I asked him a question. I said, so based on all the technologies that we got, are we winning? And his answer was, well, we've actually increased the cost of doing business for the bad guys, was his thought. That in the past, maybe they would only have to set up 1 or 2 shell companies in order to hide their ill-gotten gains. Now they've got to set up maybe 5 or 6 or 7 shell companies, and they've got to be more cognizant of the fact that there are more technologies zeroing in. Amber, what's your thought on are we winning?
I mean, I think first you have to define winning. And it's a pedantic point, I'm sure. But if you ask someone, you know, was our last FATF mutual evaluation okay? Did we get that check mark on our report card? Sure. Are we effective at preventing, detecting, and deterring financial crime? Heck no. And I think as part of that, if we're honest with each other, if we're truly honest with each other and we want to evaluate how effective this is as a system, we have to look at the cost, we have to look at the complexity, not just in terms of the cost to the banks of implementing these programs and to other regulated entities, but to the effect on Canadian citizens in terms of our time and level of effort. For a large criminal organization, it's easy to set up a multitude of shell companies. For a money service business in Canada that simply wants to do remittance for nannies from here to the Philippines, it is impossible or nearly impossible to set up a bank account. It is literally the biggest barrier to entry for entire lines of businesses. And for a first world country, we should be deeply ashamed of that. That is embarrassing. There are a number of different types of legal businesses that are essentially barred from the banking system. It is almost impossible to access banking if you are of no fixed address, if you have housing issues, if you have mental health issues. So there's all of this institutionalized poverty that we're succeeding at promoting. There are entire swaths of the population that we are locking out of the banking system, and we're really effective at stopping these folks. Like if you're a Somali immigrant trying to send money home, we are great at preventing you from doing that in a low cost effective way. But are we succeeding at stopping large scale organized financial crime?
Yeah, that's still.
Do you see all those arrests listed in the paper of those cartels that we're stopping? You do not.
Yeah, we're still that's still some ways off in the future. Okay, thank you for that. I do appreciate that. Let's move on to the second section of our discussion today, which is the challenges that are faced by the anti-corruption technologies that are out there. And you know, if you look at some of the main names, the LexisNexis and Oracles and Chainalysis and Feedzai and so forth, all these big names, all wonderful tools, and they have an awful lot of clients. But again, they face the same kinds of challenges that Amber's just discussing and Eduardo's been discussing. What kind of data are they using? Where are they getting it from? How can it be filtered? What is the human element in that? You know, who is looking at this stuff? And then as Chris has mentioned, you've got, you know, and again, you can transfer what he was discussing about governments to companies. So what sort of policies do they have? And so there are just a huge amount of challenges facing both governments and private private industry when it comes to anti-corruption technologies. So there's been massive amounts of investments in fintech, or financial industry technologies, over the last many years, looking at things like anti-fraud and anti-money laundering. Now, as I mentioned, the research and development dollars are really shifting heavily into machine learning, artificial intelligence, and what we call these sort of human out of the loop solutions, meaning you just set up an algorithm and let the technology run wild. That's not necessarily the safest solution at the moment. These technologies still require human in the loop for the most part. And I'd like to ask Paula what she thinks about this sort of the holy grail, which I have mentioned earlier, where you've just got an algorithm or a set of algorithms which have been set up, the training data has been set up, and now the machine learning program can just go off and do its thing. We have this problem of, and I don't want to get too far into this, but we do have algorithmic bias, which is it's human beings who create the algorithms. And a lot of companies have sort of come to grief over the years as to how they created their algorithms. There was a bias, towards women or against women, or towards a certain geographical sector, or in favor of a certain geographical sector, because we're human beings and we have these built-in biases and they are reflected in algorithms. So what's your thought, Paula, on just generally the human oversight that's needed with these technologies?
Well, to your point, Norman, I think the concern that most people have now, and that I'm hoping I'm going to learn a lot on this webinar about where we're getting to with that, is this idea of bias in artificial intelligence. I think it seems that human prejudice can and does work its way into algorithms that are intended to actually bring technical neutrality and support objective analysis and decision making, and it seems that really just isn't happening. And I actually came across something that I hadn't realized. The Association for Computing Machinery in New York City apparently last year called for private and government use of facial recognition technologies to be ended because of the clear bias based on ethnic, racial, gender, and other human characteristics.
Interesting.
So it's a worry. It really is a huge concern that somehow, to your point, whether it's because of who has built the algorithm or what's in the training data, that we are going to see the reproduction of these biases in AI. So on the surface, I think this idea of a human in the loop seems to be a good thing. And again, I know I've already mentioned GDPR, our privacy legislation in Europe, but they've put in provisions that people for certain kinds of automated decisions cannot be made solely automated because of those specific concerns. But the difficulty, I think, is that by bringing some kind of human oversight to algorithms that were put in place to deal with human bias seems kind of a bit circular to me. So on the one hand, we say sort of algorithms are smarter than humans, they're better than humans, but just in case they're not, we'll put a human in charge to have oversight of it. So I struggle with that a little bit, and frankly, I don't have the technical knowledge to sort of reassure myself or anyone else that that's not the case. But that does seem odd to me. And then there are factors like apparently there's research out there that suggests that humans are prone to automation bias. So it's almost like if the computer says it, it must be true. So even if humans disagree with the outcome of some of these algorithms, their tendency is to kind of go with the flow and accept it anyway, because the system must be right. So
That's,
I'm afraid
sounds like a Google search result.
Yeah.
You know, there was 10,000 hits on that. It must be true.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm afraid I actually don't really have any good answers on that. I probably just have a lot of questions that maybe, you know, Eduardo, Chris, Amber, you may have a view and hopefully reassure me.
Eduardo or Chris, do you want to field that one?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll add a comment. I mean, I think optimistically, I'd say we don't have a lot to be worried about right now in the anti-corruption space, simply because AI is a fairly long way away today. The kind of AI you're talking about that is vulnerable to bias is characteristic driven decision making and facial recognition and lots, you know, sentencing decisions, things like that, where you know humans are letting machines make recommendations or even decisions about what is or is not some, you know, outcome, like you know, in the worst case, like a criminal or not, right? We're very far away from that in the anti-corruption space. We're back at the data. Is it relevant, comprehensible, usable? And then can we start to incorporate some very basic predictive techniques to talk about the kinds of transactions or contracts that are going to be most vulnerable to corruption, and then hand them off to competent humans to actually go and do the hard work of figuring out whether it's a true positive or a false positive. That's my 2 cents anyway.
I suppose where I could get to with that is when we start thinking about things like know your customer, or perhaps trying to predict if an individual with a certain set of characteristics is likely to be more susceptible to corrupt activity or something like that. That's I guess where I could see this going, not necessarily that it would, of course.
Mm-hmm. So I've got a point I'd like to raise both with Chris and Eduardo, because they both work very closely with federal governments. And that is this idea of the data accessibility. On the one hand, because there's so much data that governments have, it's a tool for them to be able to collect knowledge on their citizens, fair enough. But if that data then is made readily and accessible and on a widespread basis, it then allows the citizens to hold their government accountable in a way that maybe some other countries don't have that same option. And I know certainly in Brazil, Eduardo, publicly, as I mentioned, publicly accessible data is there, and it is there in huge amounts. And are you seeing, and I can speak personally, but are you seeing sort of an increasing amount of the citizens being able to hold the government accountable because the government has made this data accessible?
No, I wouldn't say that. You know, the data is there, but it's still a challenger to access and, you know, to have some knowledge from that. You know, you need techniques, you need, you know, to understand ways, statistic, and, you know, it's still a huge challenge. You know, it's an ocean of data. Oh, it's right here. You know, take and use. But they are, you know, they give the information because we have a law that it calls that you know, every citizen must have the access to the information. So must have transparency, you know, in the government. But on the other hand, you know, it seems like they do it by proposal. You know, they do it's right here, you know, this huge amount of data, and do what you want, but it's still a huge challenge. So the data is there, but at the same time, you have to understand what you're going to do, what kind of technique you're going to use, what kind of relevant data you're going to use, you know, to take a decision for your business, for yourself. So it's still a challenge. And talking about, you know, as Paula was saying, talking about, you know, the artificial intelligence and, you know, the fear that we have, you know. For example, last week I was watching with my kids the Future Exterminator 2, the movie, and you know, we see that everybody's afraid that the machine comes, you know, and take the whole society. But we are, as Christopher said, we are really far away from that point now. Nowadays, we work more in automating stuff. And as I started, you know, saying that data, information, knowledge, to reach knowledge, you need the human being. Knowledge, you know, to reach the knowledge, you know, you have to have the skills, you know, all the experience, you know, that you have during your career, your professional career. So the human being is essential nowadays. And in my vision, you know, in my opinion, it's going to be for a long, long time in the future, because we are really far away from the point that technology is going to take care of everything. And that's, and at the same time, you know, the world is facing new regulations for artificial intelligence. Right now, for example, in Brazil, they are talking about this, you know, it's still in studying, you know, with the society inputs too, but it's not a law so far, but it's going to become a law, you know, in the near future. And I see in Europe too, you know, they start having regulations for that. So we're going to have control in these algorithms, you know. It's not, you know, something that we just leave and they keep doing. Even because, you know, you have to always be monitoring and analyzing the outputs, you know, to improve your model. The model is not just one and unique, and, you know, it's alive. You have to change all the time to have better results. So.
Mm-hmm. And Chris or Eduardo, maybe Chris first, because you've been working so closely with governments, it's governments that are supplying this data for the most part, apart from other private sources that, for example, maybe the, you know, International Consortium of International of Investigative Journalists and things like those sort of OSINT sources, which are great. But if you're looking at a government source, for example, internal revenue and so forth, maybe in some of the countries that you've been working with outside of the United States, is there a possibility that that data could be corrupted by someone who doesn't necessarily want that information being made public?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't have any concrete examples of it, but data is fairly straightforward to manipulate, which is all the more reason to have some kind of a standard behind the data set, some kind of a schema is what is called in the industry. So, you know, ultimately blockchain is very good at preventing what you're describing. It's because it's sort of lapidary, chipped in stone. You know, you can't really manipulate it after the fact. But yeah, it's a concern. I would say it's on my totem of concerns. It's fairly low, because I mean, I would first like to have the data and then we can talk about whether it's been, you know, manipulated, and if so, how, and what can we do to stop that. Ultimately the big challenge in this space is getting a handle on what is out there. As Eduardo is focused on, there's not today a great global benchmark. There's a lot of, I call them superficial maps of the public sector data space. But fortunately, actually, a Canadian effort initiated and funded, I think, by Canada's International Development Research Center is underway to produce something called this Global Data Barometer. And it's coming out in at the end of this year. It's allegedly going to be, I suspect, the best that there is. And it's going to score data across, including, you know, across several categories, including the one you're talking about, the governance factor, which is like how well governed is that data? How easily can it be manipulated and skewed? You know, and then other factors are like capability, availability, and impact use cases. So there's steps we can take to stop it, but it's certainly a real problem. Yeah.
And Amber, what's been your, and I actually want to follow up with you later on what you just mentioned, Chris. Amber, what's been your experience with the data that we have to work with in Canada when you're doing your investigative work, when you're trying to get companies to be to follow, to be more compliant, let's say, they have to work with external data that they're deriving from Canadian data sources, whether it's the government or elsewhere. How would you sort of how do you see Canada on that scale?
I think it's a struggle. I think we have some systems that are relatively easy to query. We have some systems that are difficult and potentially costly to query, whether it's companies' information or other types of information. I'd like to just back up a little bit, because there's a principle that I think is important when we're talking about data, which is that division between what's government data and so what's data about the government and how the government operates, where I think there's a real responsibility to transparency. And when we're talking about personal information, so identifying information about an individual, where I think there's a right to privacy that's equally important, that we always have to balance, and that always has to be part of the conversation. So I think it's important that we're not talking about data globally and as just being all the same thing. Data is data is data, because they aren't. Particularly when we're talking about things like what do we store on a blockchain, where some public blockchains are, as Christopher mentioned, immutable. And when it comes to those particular types of technologies where you're talking about an immutable publicly available record, that should not be personal information. There's no universe in which I think storing a person's KYC on a blockchain is a good, sound, safe plan for anyone ever until the end of time. And I'm very absolutist on that, but I think that it's important that first and foremost, we protect people. And that's the center of our approach. And this is the center of a lot of the criticisms of AI. Paula's article on this was so beautifully written in terms of those types of criticisms. And I think that's important, that when we're looking at data, that we always take that person-centric approach. And how does this affect the individual? Does this infringe on the individual's rights? We always need to be asking those questions. Very different conversation when it comes to how is our government operating and what types of information should be openly available and queryable by the public. When it comes to how we do on those two fronts, I think it's varied. It really depends on what we're doing. When you're talking about publicly traded companies and the information that we have on those, it's fantastic. When we're talking about certain types of regulated entities like banks or securities dealers or credit unions, you can get a whole cornucopia of information. When you're talking about other private organizations, less information is available. And when we're talking about private individuals, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that there's not actually a lot of communication between the government and private companies, even when there's a requirement to verify certain things. So one of the things that I would like to see, at least in the long term, our approach to policy and legislation consider is that if we're creating an obligation, if I as a private company must verify an individual's identity, how can the government interact with that electronically in a meaningful way? And that's a place where I think that there's probably much more meaningful policy work that can be done.
Hard to argue with that. And certainly in Canada, when people are trying to do investigative work, they do come across certain roadblocks just province to province. When it comes to property ownership, for example, you may have a fairly good access to data from some of the maritime provinces, but as you move over to Alberta or Manitoba, maybe you don't get that exact same data, and they don't share the same platforms either. There's a sort of an old axiom, which is paper is power. And if you look at countries like Brazil and India, where there's this intense amount of bureaucracy and red tape, where you need 55 copies of everything, and everything has to be signed and notarized over and over and over and stamped over and over again. And in Brazil, they have these offices, which are essentially notary public offices called cartórios. And you almost can't do anything in Brazil without having to go to a cartório. Every single document you sign, you file, you register, they all have to be in these cartorio offices, which are privately owned, and I must say they're gold mines for the owners. The good side of that is they have tons of data, and it is now being digitized. And so in Brazil, you have this opportunity now that because paper is power in the old days where the government just had all this access, had all this data on you, now you've got access, the public now has access to this, or it's going to have even more access to this same data. So the cartorios, maybe they were hated in the past, but eventually investigators are going to come to love them because they're going to be able to provide as long as you can get access to that data. And certainly in my own work, we are able to access a fair amount of data from cartorios. Because it's now being digitized, there's just more and more information going to be made available. And it's on a nationwide standardized platform basis. And certainly when you're looking at some of the other data sources that Eduardo mentioned that come from, say, the Internal Revenue Service of Brazil and whatnot on beneficial ownership, it's completely standardized. You just literally type in the tax code number of the company or the registration number of the company, and out come all the the shareholders, the main shareholders, stakeholders. You can even get the neighbors, the neighbors of the people that own the companies. So there's an immense amount of information that's available, and I think that is just a huge tool to help to curb corruption, because you have now the knowledge of the people, at least more knowledge about the people that you're planning on doing business with or planning on voting for. Okay, so and that now leads us to our final section of today, which is the future trends for anti-corruption technologies. So I'm going to ask all of you to peer into your crystal ball and have a look at what we think might be expected in the future. And I know that Chris and Eduardo have mentioned that these technologies, particularly machine learning, are still very much in their infancy. Very much true, but where is this going to be taking us? So we have some options here, and Paula has mentioned the problem with algorithms. And how those are going to be controlled in the future. So I guess I'll start with Eduardo. We have currently human-created and human-based anti-corruption processes that are biased, let's say, because of the way that we create our algorithms. Do you see a future, and I'm not talking maybe 6 months, but maybe 20 years, 30 years, 50 years from now, do you see a situation where you're going to have non-biased or non-corrupted anti-corruption technologies, which are going to be essentially they are going to meet this objective of the Holy Grail? That was for you, Eduardo.
Yeah, 30 years from now, it's something far away, but anyway, I would say that the human beings are corrupted. It's possible to be corrupted, so it's a point in the chain that it's weak, but on the other side we have the technology to control humans somehow, in the process. But I would say, we're gonna see in the following years, we are already seeing that all the operational work is gonna be replaced by algorithms. So all operational work that the humans do, that it's boring, takes time. We don't like to do that, but we must, we have to do, to complete a task. It's gonna be replaced by algorithms. On the other side, new careers will appear. New jobs is going to appear that to control all that, to improve the technology, to improve the artificial intelligence, to improve the models. So it's another way. I keep saying, and I see that in the market, that when you see, for example, a compliance officer you know, for example, background for a compliance officer opportunity. You know, you must have, you must understand the law, you must understand the compliance issue, etc. But, you know, a little bit about technology. And now they are start asking for technology, you know, they must understand about data, even because we have the data officer and a lot of them, you know, are compliance officer too. So for example, we have the cybersecurity issue, you know, comes to the compliance area department. So they have to understand data. They have to, you know, they have to understand and read the data, you know, the indicators, the KPIs. So it's changing. You know? It's another skill that, you know, you have to follow the market, you know, the trends. So it's changing, but I still, you know, I still believe that, you know, always gonna have a place for humans. You know, the humans always will be an important part of the whole engine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've got a couple of questions here from our audience. Let's have a look here. That's a pretty good one from one of our participants. And they ask, what do you do if you cannot access data from certain developing countries like Russia or China or North Korea to ensure that corruption, in terms of trying to investigate corruption? So what technologies are out there to access data from those countries? Anybody want to handle that one?
Well, I can start and then I pass on. Well, it's a challenge, of course. If you have data, you have power, you know, to decide. But at least you can, you know, improve your vision to make a better decision. So if you don't have data, it's gonna be, you know, it's gonna be difficult, and you have to take the risk somehow. On the other hand, you know, you can rely on local data sources. You know, there's a lot of credit bureaus locally that have some data from the population, the society. But imagine that you don't have nothing. Yeah, it's a huge problem, and you have to make a decision, you know, not based in technology, not based in data-driven decision.
Quite true. Thank you for that, Eduardo. I have a question from Adam Ross, who is one of Canada's foremost financial crime investigators, and who I blame completely for dragging me into the anti-corruption law program in the first place. And he asks, how concerned are the panelists about the privatization of data and its consolidation with a small number of data providers, and its impacts on commercial due diligence and the ability of other investigative researchers, such as journalists and civil society? It's a great question. So, you know, what about how all this data that's not necessarily being provided by the government, by commercial sources, and that's getting consolidated down to just a small number of data providers? Any thoughts on that? Amber, have you got any ideas on that one?
Very in the long term. I'm, despite branding myself as cynical, I'm a pathological optimist, and I do hope that eventually we have a more person-centric approach to data. I hope that we move to a policy where people have control of their data, where there's more transparency about who has the data, who holds the data, what they have to do to secure the data, and the person's ability to opt out of the data. I personally, and I realize that this is probably a horribly privilegey thing to say, but I would opt out of credit bureaus.
Interesting.
Okay.
You froze
every
a bit,
Canadian adult at this. Oh, sorry.
No, okay,
am I good?
You're back with us now.
Okay. So every Canadian adult at this point, your data has been compromised in some sort of data compromise within the last 5 years. And that should be shocking and appalling to all of us. But that's an accurate statistic. And so we need to do better.
and how can we do better?
I think accountability. I think accountability is the only way to do better. And in my opinion, it needs to be a person-centric accountability. So for instance, when a large credit bureau is compromised, I should be able to say to them, no, I no longer grant you permission to hold my data, and they should be required to delete any data that they have about me and not collect any more. And that should be true of every company unless they have a legislative obligation to retain it, in which case I should be able to tell them to delete it as soon as their legislative obligation ends.
Interesting.
And I do feel that I've sort of gone on a little bit about the GDPR, the data privacy regulation in Europe, but frankly, I do feel that it affords some of that control, that individual control that Amber has been talking about, and our expectation of our right to privacy, connecting that with our civil liberties to some extent as well. And really taking this stuff seriously. I just saw this morning, I think the EU are all of the data privacy authorities within the EU, but starting with an action in Luxembourg, are looking to fine Amazon $425 million for data privacy breaches. I know that's a drop in the ocean compared with Amazon's revenues, but at least, I think certainly in Europe, we are relatively fortunate with the legislation and a kind of determination to hold some of these organizations to account.
And well done, Europe. Chris, this is something I wanted to talk to you at sort of further length about, and this is sort of looking into the crystal ball, but it's also something that's happening now, and that is the development of GovTech. And I mentioned at the beginning of my introductory remarks that we would be talking a little bit about GovTech, and these are essentially just technologies developed either for or by governments in order to streamline typical government services, such as delivery of water or electricity or tax collection or what have you. And it's a growing field. I believe it helps to curb corruption because it makes the information that much more transparent, particularly in terms of e-procurement and so forth. I'm going to presume that your program at Microsoft has been fairly active in this area, or at least is going to be moving into this area.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we're supportive of it. It can cut both ways. I mean, if you automate it responsibly without good governance, and if you take people out of the equation, that can in some cases be unhelpful in the fight against corruption. But on balance, I think this space, GovTech, if you want to call it that, is one where there are easy gains to be made, particularly taking human touch points out of low value bureaucratic processes where they're just not really adding. I mean, someone on the call, I think Amber made this point about, there still being an opportunity to solicit bribes after a property bid in a developed nation like Canada. The fact that there are government officials that still do retain that power that can be abused in order to, for personal gain, the very definition of corruption. I mean, those are, to the extent GovTech can eliminate those kinds of opportunities, that's a positive for us. And yes, that's the first category of solution that we're really looking at, is how can we help to use technology to automate some of these processes that are vulnerable to corruption in their manual form.
Yeah, I can certainly see how a government bureaucrat, for example, who's been responsible for a certain area within the government, now sees that their little fiefdom is going to be replaced or somehow having to get married with a GovTech solution, and all of a sudden their opportunity to be charging bribes to people is going to be removed. And so I could see where, yeah, it certainly can cut both ways. Eduardo, how is that same topic, GovTech, growing in Brazil?
Well, it's something that it's it's right there. There's a lot of new companies coming on. GovTechs, trying to help government here in Brazil, because government here, I think, the same in other parts of the world, keep increasing, and the tax is increasing, but at the same time, our service for society is not that good. So you don't have more space to hire more people for government, and you have to use technology to improve the process that already exists. So it's a challenge, and there's a lot of startups, GovTechs that trying to solve that kind of issue in different kinds of solutions. At the same time, we have the HAG tax, for regulatory issues, and it's something that we are seeing right now happening. It's a lot, but at the same time, government has a specific time, so it's different. The contract, all the environment, is different from the private sector. So it's a different world, I would say. Mm-hmm. But the technology is right there, to help. The government needs a lot of help, to invest in technology.
I think all governments do. We've had a couple of questions come in about blockchain and how blockchain can be used to help to combat corruption. Amber had some thoughts on data storage within blockchain. Eduardo, I know you can probably go on for hours about blockchain. Chris, are you, with your program and working with governments around the world, are you trying to steer them in that direction?
Not specifically, no. I mean, I don't think we're championing, I wouldn't say we're championing blockchain as an Uber solution or as a component that's off the shelf for everyone to use. I think there's situations where it's appropriate, but I mean, our experience so far is there are much lower hanging or lower lying pieces of fruit to take. And there's so much help that is so much faster and easier to give than trying to get heavy IT systems and data aggregation in place to implement blockchain, figure out where it's appropriate, and set it loose. It would probably require some degree of legislative action, and depending on what you're talking about, because there are dictates about the form in which data is collected and et cetera. So no, I think it's promising. Maybe in 5 to 10 years we'd have a different conversation about it, but it's not where we're focused right now, simply because there's so many more opportunities that are easier to reach.
Another sort of crystal ball possibility that is actually here and now, and has been in service for quite some time, and certainly in Brazil, is digital signatures. Now, when I lived in Brazil, the federal government, through some third-party providers, would provide, I don't have one with me right here, but just essentially a little thumb drive or a flash drive, they're called. In Brazil, they call them a pen drive. Or you can get a chip card, which is basically about the size of a credit card, and you end up getting a reader, or if your computer has a reader built in. And the data that you need to submit, which is not particularly complex, but the data that you need to submit to the federal government then goes into your digital signature, and then you can sign documents, and would hopefully curb corruption in terms of fraudulent or forged signatures on contracts. I know a cousin of mine in Brazil once found, and he owned a fairly large piece of property, and one day he found a lot of squatters on his property. And when he tried to kick them off, they said, no, we have this contract here that we own this property. And somebody had gone and signed on, that they were the owner of the property. Well, that would be very tough to do now with digital signatures. So digital signatures in Brazil is very much a federal government driven process. Here in Canada, much less so. And Paula, you mentioned to me yesterday that you've been using digital signatures in the UK. And Chris, your knowledge of it in the States seems, still it's not necessarily the most, yes, it's used, but is it really being thought of as an anti-corruption tool? I'll toss that one out to the panel.
Yeah, just to add, Norman, here in Brazil, we have the digital certification. We have the electronic ID. You are referring to the electronic ID. Yeah, the electronic ID is something that, you know, so far it's private. You have to pay an annual fee to have that. It's something that gives you more security. So it's a one more level of security. But on the other hand, you know, it's not something that's reachable for the whole population, because, you know, there's some cost to have that, but it still helps. But on the other side, you have the digital signature, you know, when you have the virtual contracts, principally now in the pandemic. So everything, you know, got really fast. Everybody started using that. I remember when I was dealing some contracts, you know, with some law departments, customers of us, and, you know, they said, no, we want to sign a physical contract. It was something really important for them. And then after that, you know, after this period that we are passing through, you know, the pandemic, you know, it changed totally. So now it's really, you know, something totally normal, you know, to sign a digital contract. And you have security, you have trust on both sides. So it's something that changed completely.
Mm-hmm. And Amber, someone who's like yourself, who's right in the trenches every day dealing with this stuff, what would you like to see in terms of this sort of marriage between what humans need and can do and what technology can do in order to fight anti-money, to fight money laundering, to fight fraud, to fight corruption? You know, if you could sort of wave your magic wand, say this is within the realms of reality, you know, how would you see this as something that could be a future solution?
I would love to see compliance and policy culture take a page from the technology book in terms of just being able to experiment and having a learning culture. I think that's where we get stuck sometimes. We really start to do a process, it doesn't work, we double down on it, we triple down on it. Sometimes we're decades into it and it's not any more effective, and we're not acknowledging that it's not working. The other piece that I would love to see is just more of those resources, more of the compliance resources, more of the investigative resources, not on the side of the house where we're talking about early detection of something that may or may not be suspicious, but probably isn't, because mass surveillance doesn't tend to yield great results, but more tools really dedicated to supporting those investigations, supporting those prosecutions, supporting those places where we've detected an issue. This is not a drill. This is not a false positive. We are aware that there is an issue. How do we actually get to seizing the bad guy's stuff, or arresting them, or prosecuting them in the large, you know, in the long term, particularly when it comes to very complex, large-scale financial crime. That's where I think that we're just not very effective, and we're incredibly under-resourced across the board.
That's a terrific comment, and certainly it sort of points to you know, these solutions for the future that we all envision. I liked one that I saw the other day, which is this marriage between OSINT and big data analytics, where you have I guess it was the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists who'd we're working with all the data from the Luanda leaks. So first we had the Panama Papers and all these other various leaks. We had the Luanda leaks, which is from Angola in Africa, where just a massive amount of data was made available. Very difficult for even an army of human beings to sift through it, but they used machine learning to look for certain patterns and certain bits of financial information in this data, which eventually led to, I won't mention her name, but I think she was the daughter of the president of Angola, and ultimately she was known as the richest woman in Africa. And it just pointed to all manner of corrupt activity associated with her. So this sort of, as I said, this marriage between OSINT and machine learning is something that I think we're going to probably see more of. So we've only got a couple of minutes left, and then we'll have John Ritchie come in and give a closing comment. But I'd like to ask, and I'd like, first of all, I want to thank Paula, Chris, and Eduardo and Amber for your experience and sharing your insight today. It's just been fantastic. And I just maybe ask you for maybe a closing comment, just a closing observation from each of you on maybe the state of anti-corruption technologies, or where you think we're headed, or one particular challenge that you'd like, just something that you'd like to leave the people with today. You can start with whoever wants to dive in first.
I think from my perspective, if you're a policymaker, if you're a builder, if I've said something that's upset you today, please prove me wrong. Nothing makes me happier when I offer these criticisms than when someone builds something incredible and proves me wrong. I welcome it. And if you're building something great, I'd love to hear about it.
Hear, hear. Well done, Amber. Paula, any thoughts?
Sure. I mean, I think from my perspective, pessimistic as I may have sounded, I am actually very optimistic about the potential of technology to help, you know, in the fight against corruption. And I think some of the things that we've heard from, you know, Christopher and Eduardo about the things they're working on just does give me that sense of optimism. But I think it's just really important not to lose sight of the role of human agency, basically. You know, we mustn't get to a point where the perception is that the machine's doing all the checking, so the individual doesn't have to be diligent. You know, we need people to have a sense of autonomy, empowerment. One of the worst things for me, I think, is when you talk to people about issues like corruption and they say, I think it's wrong, but it's just how it is around here, and there's, you know, nothing can be done. I think something can be done. I think technology can play a huge part in that, but it's essentially, for me, still down to the human agency.
Excellent. Chris or Eduardo?
Yeah, I just say, you know, be creative and curious to the enforcer community out there. We're looking for partners. I think a lot of people are surprised at what is possible with partnership with domain experts when you bring technology experts together with anti-corruption experts in a non-commercial posture, particularly, which is what the ACTS program is. It's not a sales effort. It's absolutely a you know, open-minded, open source driven sort of effort to help governments solve hard problems. So that's the lesson I think people learn.
Wonderful. Eduardo, I'll give you the final word.
Yeah, I would go, you know, with Christopher and Paul and Amber. You know, I believe, you know, I'm a techie guy, and I'm optimism by the future. You know, I think that technology is here to improve our lives. You know, to help government principally. You know, and you know, to against corruption, you know, to fight against corruption and fraud and everything. So, and of course we have the human beings, you know, with huge knowledge to help to develop these solutions. We already, you know, we see in the market, and then in here is an invitation for everybody. You know, there's a lot of startups, you know, RegTechs, for example, GovTechs, as we said, you know, with wonderful solutions, you know, that they are developing. As I said at the beginning, you know, the technology is becoming more and more commodity, but, you know, we are having a lot of new solutions, you know, a lot of innovation coming, you know, to the market, and it's available, you know, it's available for everybody. You know, it's not something that just for big companies and huge contracts. No, you know, it's all, you have to be open for innovation, you know, to try to test and see if it's gonna help you somehow. And the government, I think, is the same. You know, the government now has a lot of tools to use, you know, to improve, you know, the service that gives to the society. So I'm optimistic about the future.
The future looks bright.
Yeah.
Great. Well, that wraps it up from our discussion today. I want to thank Paula Davis over in the UK, Chris Nelson in Seattle, Eduardo Tardelli down in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Amber Scott for your extreme candor. It's deeply appreciated. To all of you, your thoughts, your insight, your predictions, just fantastic. I hope the participants today have enjoyed listening to these wonderful individuals, the information that they've conveyed to you, and hopefully you'll be able to take some of this knowledge that they've shared and apply it to your own operations very profitably. So thank you very much for this wonderful discussion, and all of you. I hope I'm able to be interacting with you all over the long term. I look forward to it. And now I want to turn it over to the co-founder of the Anti-Corruption Law Program, Joe Weiler, for his closing comments.
Yeah, I'll just take a minute here. I just want to give.
It's John. Oh, there it is. There you go, Joe. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to give special thanks today to Norm Baldwin. We're all volunteers in the Anti-Corruption Law Program, and Norm this year has taken a sort of a major leadership role as a key member of our leadership working group. He's helped organize a number of our webinars. He's been a panelist, he's been a moderator, and today he was a panelist and a moderator. And you just did a great job. It's a pleasure to work with Norm. Thank you.
Thanks,
John.
And
looking forward, over the next couple of months, we're going to take a break for a month. And then we're going to we'll reassemble at the end of August. We're actually working on the third of a trilogy. We did a month ago, we did whistleblowing, today technology and anti-corruption. And we're working on whistleblowing and technology and anti-corruption, what Paula was talking about. So then in the next month, we'll have the roster will resume again for our monthly webinars starting in September through the rest of the year. So, and we'll send that to you within a month. So have a great summer, everyone. Bye for now. Thanks very much.
Okay.